What's going on, everyone? The Sweet Lou here. I said in my Breath of the Wild ending analysis video that I would make another video about Breath of the Wild's timeline placement. As always, OP delivers. If you look online, there's no shortage of debate on what timeline Breath of the Wild falls, and with the new DLC pack coming out this Friday, I felt like it was a cool time to throw my 2 cents into the timeline arena. We're on the internet, it's always a free-for-all in terms of fan theory and whatnot, but I think the situation is also partially the fault of Aonuma, a longtime producer in the Zelda series. In an interview with Game Informer, Aonuma explains that Breath of the Wild does indeed land within their official timeline, after Ocarina of Time.
Does Breath of the Wild take place before or after Ocarina of Time?
Now, if you're a Zelda aficionado, you know that saying that is kind of like saying that this isn't a good idea. For the rest of you who didn't understand that joke, here's a brief overview of the official Zelda timeline. We start with Skyward Sword, which deals with the origins of the Master Sword and ultimately demise the early incarnation of Ganon. This is followed by the Minish Cap and Four Swords, where we learn of another antagonist, Vati. Then we get to everyone's favorite, Spirit Tracks. Just kidding, that one sucked wiener. The next game in the continuity is the masterpiece Ocarina of Time. In Ocarina of Time, we fight Ganondorf with the Master Sword. The dilemma presented in Ocarina of Time is that when Child Link draws the Master Sword, his body isn't ready to wield its power. As such, he resides within the Sacred Realm for 7 years. During his dormant state, Ganon gets his hands on the Triforce of Power and devastates Hyrule. Ocarina of Time, like many time travel tales, creates story complications. At the end of Ocarina, the timeline splits in 3. The Downfall timeline, where the hero is defeated, the Child Era timeline, where Link goes back in time and warns Zelda of Ganondorf and thereby prevents his rise to power, and the Adult Era timeline, where adult Link and Zelda seal Ganon away in the Sacred Realm. Confused yet? Good. In the Downfall timeline, we have A Link to the Past, followed by Oracle of Ages and Oracle of Seasons, then Link's Awakening, the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, and Link's Adventure. To make things a little bit more complicated here, apparently Nintendo updated this timeline recently in a Japanese book release. I can't read Japanese, so I can't tell you if this is 100% accurate, but it's worth mentioning, I think. The revised Downfall timeline has the order A Link to the Past, the Oracle games, Link's Awakening, A Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Legend of Zelda, and Link's Adventure. Anyway, all you really need to know about this timeline is that Ganon comes back a shitload of times. In the Child Era, we have Majora's Mask, followed by Twilight Princess, and finally Four Swords Adventures. For this timeline, it's important to note that there are no significant Ganon attacks, but plenty of Ganondorf, the human form of Ganon. And there's a little bit of Vati here as well. And last but not least, we have the Adult Era timeline. This timeline includes Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. This timeline gets a little bit complicated. Because Zelda sent Link back in time to warn her younger self of Ganon's rise to power, she essentially creates the child timeline. But she remains on the adult timeline, where there is no Link to battle Ganon. Once Zelda sent Link back into the child timeline, she puts the Master Sword back, thus sealing the Door of Time. After many years of sealing the Master Sword away, Ganondorf breaks free, and though the people pray for the return of their hero, he never comes. In a last-ditch effort, the gods flood the planet, and thus Wind Waker was born. So now that you have a basic knowledge of the timeline, where does Breath of the Wild land? Well, the simple answer is, it's not so simple. Allow me to explain. I'm not really convinced of one timeline being the perfect answer. What we do know conclusively is that Breath of the Wild lands as the most recent title on the timeline. According to this guy, it takes place in an age long after any of the titles released to date. It is the most recent age, and because of this, we believe players will be able to easily immerse themselves in the game. Of course, regardless of the time period, the story does unfold in Hyrule, so for those who have played other titles in the series, there will be a lot of recognizable places to enjoy. In a much broader sense, the game references many of the previous Zelda titles in the series. This is a beautiful thing for longtime Zelda fans like myself. However, it makes timeline placement a bit tricky because they seem to pull references from multiple timeline branches. Just look at the map. Many of the names of lakes and mountains in the game are directly referencing previous heroes. You got Tingle Island, Rito Mountain, Darunia Lake. Hyrule Castle. These are all fine and good. They're nice nods to the previous games, but they're not really compelling evidence, right? I mean, in reality, the creator could have just liked those characters. Instead of listing out all the references at once, I've decided to organize them based on the references' respective evidence for timeline placement. Wow, that was probably the most unfuckable sentence I've ever said. Thanks, Nintendo. For me, the jury is still out. I really don't know which timeline to place my money on, so I'm gonna tell you everything I know. Let me know in the comments section below which timeline you think Breath of the Wild falls on. When I first started playing Breath of the Wild, I initially thought that it was meant to be a part of the Child Era timeline. In one of the memory sequences, Zelda directly references Link's past incarnations. Though I'm not completely convinced of this, some people on Reddit swear that while the camera is on Daruk in this scene, Zelda's dialogue references the sea and links to the past.
Gee, this is uplifting. She's making it sound like we already lost.
Wasn't this your idea? You're the one who wanted to designate the appointed night with all the ceremonial pomp, grandeur, and nonsense we could muster.
This discrepancy exists because the audio mix on the scene is quite different in other languages, making it much easier to isolate what Zelda is saying. Thanks to this Reddit user, we have a translation for the Japanese dialogue in the scene. Demon Bane's sword, born in a distant past, sounds like it could be a reference to a link to the past. And you cross the seas when you seek the gold made by the gods sounds like a nod to Wind Waker. But I don't speak or read Japanese, so I personally don't have any hard proof of the latter half of Zelda's speech. So make of this whatever you'd like. Considering I can't definitively prove this, I'm only going by what I heard in the scene. And if we're only going by what's audible in the English dialogue here,
whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight,
we can clearly see that Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess all land along one particular timeline, the Child Era. While that's a pretty compelling argument, check out some of these game aesthetics that reflect the art design of previously mentioned entries. The goddess statue is more or less unaltered. The Temple of Time seems to merely be a decimated version of the Ocarina of Time temple. The Lake Hylia Bridge looks awfully familiar too. We also have what appears to be a stone statue in memory of Darmani, the Goron hero from Majora's Mask. We can even go to the Arbiter's Ground from Twilight Princess, or what's left of it, I suppose. Now I know what you're thinking, but Lou, if we're on the Child Era timeline, why is the Rito species there? Well, these birdie beauties were only in a few entries in the series, specifically being introduced in Wind Waker. And if you remember from what I said earlier, Wind Waker is part of the Adult Era timeline. To make things just a bit more complex, we're not specifically limited to the Adult Era timeline here. As Aonuma said, the Rito are the evolved form of the Zora that appeared in Ocarina of Time. It begs the question though, why would the Zoras be forced to evolve into Rito? Why would some of them choose not to evolve, since we have both Zora and Rito side by side in Breath of the Wild? Well, the Zelda wiki hypothesizes that the dangerous waters presented in Termina and Majora's Mask forced more of the Zora out of the waters. Between the murky seas and the lack of fish to eat, potentially some of the Zoras were forced to evolve. This remains consistent too, as the Zora of Hyrule were unaffected by this catastrophe, giving us both Zora and Rito. If you're still not convinced by this, let's look at humans and monkeys. Cited from PBS, humans share a common ancestor with modern African apes like gorillas and chimpanzees. Scientists believe this common ancestor existed 5 to 8 million years ago. Shortly thereafter, the species diverged into two separate lineages.
Yes, science!
And now for my smoking gun, the fourth wall breaker. We look again at Aonuma. During the development of Breath of the Wild, he was interviewed by Famitsu and was quoted in saying, "While making the latest title for The Legend of Zelda, when I look at this remake, I feel like this is the origin point of the new title we're making right now. After playing this game, you may have some "oh, I see" moments when playing the upcoming new game, so I'll be glad if you play Twilight Princess HD while waiting in anticipation for the latest title of The Legend of Zelda." Isn't it convenient that during the wait for Breath of the Wild, Nintendo released the HD remaster of Twilight Princess? almost as if we were meant to replay it beforehand to be ready for the story of Breath of the Wild. With the HD remaster of Twilight Princess came the Wolf Link amiibo, and while it might be weird to consider amiibos part of the lore, the Wolf Link amiibo does indeed summon Wolf Link to aid your journey in Breath of the Wild. So if we were to take the amiibo as canon, which honestly I don't know how much sense that makes, but we would have to accept the fact that Twilight Princess did indeed happen within the same timeline as Breath of the Wild. And while talking about Twilight Princess, it's hard not to bring up the addition of the strange new mural in Twilight Princess HD. The biggest thing to point out there is the Rito and the younger Link depiction. It could reference events taking place before Breath of the Wild. I would like to specifically look at the rightmost panel in the mural. Many on Reddit and other forums call the smaller creature there in Uko the Twilight creature from Twilight Princess. However, what if that's meant to depict the evolution of certain Zora into Rito? Get your tinfoil hats on, boys, we're blowing the lid off this thing. While I think the child-era timeline is a pretty safe bet, there are definitely some discrepancies present within that line of thought. I found the Zora monuments to be a pretty unlikely piece of evidence, though after reading through them all thoroughly, I realized that one of the tablets makes a pretty big claim against the child-era timeline. It is said that Rito then awoke as a sage, facing this foe alongside the Princess of Hyrule and the hero of legend. So in theory, this slate could not have existed if Rito was never awakened as a sage, meaning that technically, this game would need to have occurred on either the adult or downfall timelines. Think about it, if Link reverts time to warn Zelda, all of the events are undone, meaning that Rito wouldn't have awakened as a sage. But we are talking about time travel in Ocarina, so things can get hairy. In all reality, Breath of the Wild could tie both the child era and the downfall timelines together in the end based on some commonality among the timelines. We also have the Triforce to consider here. While it's barely mentioned throughout the story, we clearly see that Zelda possesses the entire Triforce in the end. This could be more evidence pointing towards the downfall timeline. If Link was in fact defeated by Ganon, Zelda could have scooped up his portion of the Triforce. The Triforce of Power is still somewhat unaccounted for in this theory though. Moreover, this is all speculation. I could be completely wrong. If we look more into the timeline itself, we can see that there actually are mention of several Ganon attacks, which brings a bit more legitimacy to this timeline as well, since Hyrule has been ravaged by Ganon several times in the past. This is true of the Downfall timeline, and not so true of the others. Furthermore, the Downfall timeline is given a bit more legitimacy based on the tunic of the Wild, largely resembling the clothing of Link in the original Legend of Zelda, as well as the Adventure of Link. And since we're talking about aesthetics, not those aesthetics, geez. If we're talking about aesthetics, we can't ignore that some of the key design elements borrowed from the Legend of Zelda from the NES. Of the three timeline branches, I tend to find the adult era to be the least plausible. Many people on Reddit argue that the abundance of sea salt formed by an ancient sea in the game suggests that the land in Breath of the Wild may have been submerged at some point and dried up over the course of time. But hear me out, the game preserves its history for 10,000 years. The people remember the last Ganon attack. More importantly, the game points out that there have been numerous Ganon attacks. They point out ancient Sheikah technology too. You know what they don't point out? The entire world, being flooded. I think it would be a pretty major historic event that would have been marked down. And I know what you're thinking. Who would have recorded it? Everyone drowned. Well, what about the Zoras, who went on to evolve into the Rito? Surely some of these fish people who could swim would live to tell the tale. And let's also consider that as far as we know, in this timeline, the Master Sword wasn't in the Lost Woods. It was in Ganon's face at the bottom of the sea.
Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me.
But perhaps one of the biggest discrepancies to bring up about timelines in general deals with Skyward Sword. Throughout Skyward Sword, you're guided by Fi, a spirit who lives within the Goddess Sword, which is later forged into the Master Sword. And if you're up to date with Zelda timelines, Skyward Sword is chronologically the first in the series. Now from my perspective, I think it's fairly obvious that these games were not initially created with a timeline in mind. With the timeline being canon now, the designs seem to make more obvious efforts to tie these games together. So why is the voice so important? I mean, after all, Link doesn't hear it throughout the game, does he? Well, the addition of Fi in this game creates some interesting inconsistencies throughout the rest of the Zelda series. In theory, Fi is sleeping within the Master Sword at the end of Skyward Sword, a sad separation of Link and his companion. It's never explicitly stated that Fi died, or left the Master Sword even, just that she's dormant. Since we now hear Fi in Breath of the Wild, we are led to assume that Fi has always been living within the Master Sword. And since Zelda directly references Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, and Twilight Princess, that implies that Fi was within the Master Sword in all 3 of those games. It begs the question, why didn't any of those Links hear Fi? Perhaps Breath of the Wild is a new branch of Zelda lore, creating its own path in this timeline chart. With all that stuff out of the way, it's time to go there. Is the timeline a load of shit? Well, similarly to the rest of the video, I'm gonna have to give you a big fat maybe. Nintendo is known for putting gameplay before story, and it's a good quality to have. Their games are usually well crafted, rewarding, and fun. It's also not to say that the stories take a back seat or anything, but consider this. The Legend of Zelda games were around for a long time before any kind of a timeline existed. Do you really think they were planning on making the original Legend of Zelda game towards the end of the Downfall timeline back in 1986? Or do you think maybe the series got popular and fans theorized a link among the games, so they decided to put a label on it? And in doing just that, they found themselves in a scenario where they had to craft a story to make these games connect. Games that weren't necessarily designed to fit together. Well shit, that was a long chat. I'd love to know what you think about all this. Feel free to argue about the timeline placement in the comments below. Hopefully, the upcoming DLC packs will shine more light on this topic, and maybe put the debate to rest once and for all. You better believe I'll be there to talk about it. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you love the new DLC. Thanks for listening, guys. I am the Sweet Lou.